I'm Paul Sullivan, your host on the Company of Dads podcast, where we explore the sweet, sublime, strange, and silly aspects of being a lead dad in a world where men, who are the primary parents, often feel they have to hide or at least not talk about their roles. One thing I know from personal experience is being a lead dad is not a traditional role for men. Parenting is so often left to mothers or caregivers. But here at the Company of Dads, our goal is to shake all that off and create a community for fathers who are lead dads and to welcome other dads who want to learn. Today, my guest is Kenneth Braswell. Kenneth is the Chief Executive Officer of Fathers Incorporated, a widely recognized national and international nonprofit that supports fathers, researchers, and policymakers, and also provides capacity building services to thousands of organizations working to ensure that fathers contribute to the healthy well-being of their children. Additionally, he serves as the National Director of the National Responsible Fatherhood Clearinghouse, directing and guiding the strategic activities of this group. He's the author of several books, including his autobiography, When the Tear Won't Fall, 4 children's books, and he's got a graphic novel in the works. Kenneth, welcome to the Company of Dads podcast.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you for thinking of me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah. So you're a dad to 5 kids, and I know you're a guardian to one more. What have you learned personally about fatherhood as you've gone through this journey? You know, what has each kid taught you over the years?
Being a father and then doing this work, I try very hard not to analyze my fatherhood with the work that I do of fatherhood, right? Because, my kids are vastly different, all of them, and yet there's some commonality of threads, between them. They're all ambitious, as I am. They all tend to have very narrow and intentional focus about whatever it is they want to do. They are all challenging in their own way. My 4 girls, who are all out of my house now. And so, and now having 2 boys in my house is a very different experience. And so what I've been able to do, with all of those things is learn more about myself as an individual than I have about my children, right? And then what are those things that I'm learning about myself that I want to share with my children? I think to answer your question, one of the biggest things I've learned is patience, not trying to parent too fast, not trying to force my children to be independent too fast, not to take myself too seriously too quickly, right? And having patience, even with my business of doing fatherhood, having patience in the understanding, Paul, that I can't do it all. However, at the same time, there is a great need out there, and it is a growing need. And there are not enough fingers to put in all of the holes in the dike that are bleeding with the pain of children not having fathers in their lives, of fathers struggling to be in their children's lives, of families dealing with some levels of father absence, even with the parents or in their own individual situations. And so I've had to temper my need to want to save the world, and to be able to position myself to speak to the voices that hear me, right? And work with those fathers and support and love on others such as yourself, for being a soldier in this field with me, so that I don't have to feel like I have to do it all, that I have peers of other men out there who share my passion about fathers in particular, that are doing their thing in their space based on their calling to help in this effort.
That's great. Take us back. Take the listeners back, 30 plus years. How did you get into this space? How did this become, something that you got passionate about and you wanted to really be involved in?
I was trucking along, doing what young men do, chasing girls, and following wherever the wind was blowing at the time. Was moving in on a path to become a computer analyst. That's something that I wanted to do. I was extremely interested in computers and computer programming and accounting, both at the same time. I was equally interested in both of those. Went to college to major in both of those things, both accounting and computer science. Got a great job with the state of New York when computers were just beginning to really build themselves up in corporate offices. Got a programming gig. They were paying me more money than I knew how to handle, at 26 years old, writing programs for the state of New York, particularly to count all of the housing stock in the state of New York, to completely automate their contracting system, contracts, payments, monitoring, you name it. I was writing code in DBase 3 and Lotus 123, and I'm dating myself.
You're dating, the young dads listen to this, like, what is this guy talking about?
Right? Word perfect, right? Oh no, Page Maker. Those are the things I cut my teeth on.
The listeners are having this image, Kenneth, of like a little hamster in a wheel powering these computers back then.
Absolutely. And I'm going along that track, and I worked for a gentleman by the name of Dr. Jack Conway. Dr. Jack Conway was a technical writer for the state of New York Housing and Community Renewal, whose past was extremely interesting. Didn't know how interesting it was when I met him. His dad was the chairperson for the Diocese of Catholic Charities in the state of in New York, which was huge at the time. Right. And his father was also personal friends with Malcolm X. And Dr. Conway was an anthropologist in a state job writing technical reports for the state of New York. Graduated his master's from the University of Phoenix in the area of African American studies, Native American studies, and Irish American studies. And we used to sit down and he would tell me stories and talk to me about his journey and his path and learning about these cultures. And he would tell me stories about Malcolm X coming to his house and him sitting in the other room listening to him and his father, listening to Malcolm X and his father having conversations in the other room after dinner. He would tell me these stories. And at the time, I wasn't doing anything philanthropic. I wasn't doing anything with not-for-profits. And somewhere along the line, he just stirred up this need for me to do more in my community, to get out and use some of my gifts and talents. I was a great writer, great logical thinker, I had all of these talents that I wasn't using. And I actually went out to a group that was doing some community work. They were planning the New York State African-American Black Arts, African-American Festival. It's the largest Black festival in the state of New York. And so I walk into this apartment where, several other folks in the community, and they're talking about planning this conference, planning this thing, and I had never done that work before. And as I was walking through that path, met all of these other different interesting and high-level people that were working specifically with African Americans. And we did a great job in doing that. And I caught the bug of actually working in my community. Yep. Fast forward 15 years in, from maybe 12 years into that. I published 2 newspapers. I was the vice president of the Urban League of Northeastern New York. I sat on the boards of the NAACP, Big Brothers Big Sisters, YMCA, Boys and Girls Club, you name it. Wow. I had my finger in everything that relates to community.
I mean, you went from 0 to 60 in a few years in terms of your involvement.
Quickly, really fast. And in all of that, I was also doing radio. So I had this thirst for wanting to be a DJ, wanting to be a radio personality, to be in some big market and doing radio. And so I moved from New York City, moved to Albany, New York, after coming out of the military and having my first child, to which I had a broken, disconnected relationship with. I was young and dumb when my daughter was born. My wife and I got married at 18 years old. Neither one of us knew what we were doing, what we were supposed to be doing. Our relationship was oil and water, and it just went bad. And I moved to Albany and left my daughter and her in Brooklyn. And in 1999, my second daughter was born. And when I first found out that her mom was pregnant, kind of just like went crazy. I didn't want any kids because I had vowed not to have any kids ever again. Like, I felt I made the biggest mistake with Tiara. Did not want to make that mistake with any other kids. My father was absent from my life. I did not want to bring another child into this world to experience what I experienced. And something about Nzinga changed my heart. Something about her changed who I was and what I wanted to do. And I made a commitment that she was not going to experience the same measure of father absence that I experienced with my father and my youngest daughter experienced with me. And so till today, I still call her my game changer. I call Nzinga my game changer. She changed the game for me. And I went all in. And being her dad. Her mother and I weren't married, but I was, working and I was changing diapers and all the things that, you weren't supposed to be, men weren't doing that. And we're only talking 2001, right? It's not like we're talking 1965. We're talking
right. 20 years ago. Yeah.
Right, 20 years ago. But still, Dad, our conversation around fatherhood has come a long way in 20 years. And I don't think people understand that it hasn't been too long ago that the traditional stronghold of society's notion of who fathers are was well intact early 2000s, right? Before we began to have a lot of this responsible fatherhood conversation. About a year and a half into that relationship, her mother and I broke up and we found ourselves in family court, not for child support, but trying to determine custody because we just could not get along and figure out how we were going to share custody. And we went into the court, both of us, and we didn't end on bad terms. We weren't at each other's throats. We weren't those kinds of, we were best friends when we got together. And that was strong enough to hold us close enough together so that we didn't become enemies to each other.
Right, and so that you could sort it out for your daughter, so you could kind of put her needs first.
Yeah, and we come out of court one day, after Nzinga was doing an evaluation that they were putting on her. Think about that. 2 years old. Right. Courts are doing an evaluation to find out whether or not which parent she should be with. And we walked out the door that day and Shani goes, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" And I said, "Yeah." And she turned to me and she said, "We don't belong here." She goes, "We should not allow the government to tell us how to raise our child. We're two intelligent individuals that can figure out how to do this without their intervention." And so we went to mediation to put together a parenting plan. Mm-hmm. We came out of mediation and we went back to court and we told the judge that we weren't moving forward with what we wanted to do, but we had a parenting plan that we wanted to put on record so that at any point in our life, we weren't getting along, that we would always fall back to the parenting plan, meaning throughout the years, we could adjust, that we can move and things could happen. But if we were in a space where we weren't getting along, our fallback was always the original.
Right, you could have somebody say, "Look, remember what we negotiated when cooler heads, things are going fine." Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Right. And in the 22 years or the 19 years of her life that we actually had to move her back and forth, never had to go back to that piece of paper. We figured it out and we worked it out. And that day, a couple of days after that, I began to start thinking about the work that I was doing, and I was talking to other men and I was talking to other guys. And all I remember is this venom from guys that I was talking to about the court system and about
the court system as it pertained to their individual lives or as it pertained to their families.
To being fathers and going through the court system and child support. And I didn't experience that. So I didn't know anything about that. The court, we were in there briefly, we were in and out. So I didn't know what that was. I didn't know the level of animosity that fathers had for child support, that visceral, nastiness that they had in their voices. I'm like, man, how could a system get you all riled up like that? Like you cursing at her, you cursing at, you just mad. And I met these guys that was running a father's rights organization in New York. They wanted me to come and speak to them about fatherhood, but wanted me to speak to them about fathers' rights. I'm new, I'm green, I don't know anything about fathers' rights organizations. I walk in, I'm like, oh, yeah, fathers' rights, that makes sense to me logically. Yeah, fathers should have rights,
Right.
you know, until I walked in and these guys are yelling and screaming and they got signs and they're wanting to go up to the legislature's offices and barge into their offices and demand shared parenting. And one
Yeah.
guy was outside scaling the side of the building and they was on the news that night. It was absolutely crazy.
But you were there in what capacity? What capacity did they invite you?
You know, a friend of mine knew that I was going through some stuff and we were having these
Right,
conversations.
but what were you doing for a job back then? What were you doing for a living?
At the time, I was working with the Urban League of Northeastern New York. I was
Okay.
doing community building. I was doing
Yeah.
doing community work. So people kind of knew me, you know, for always looking out, particularly for men in workforce development and looking out for moms that were in TANF and trying to transition and
Yeah.
get their lives right. So people kind of knew me for that. Wasn't yet in the fatherhood space. I was
But
just
you're still coming in as a good guy, as a
as a good
sympathetic
guy.
hero. And so imagine if you weren't the good guy coming in. I mean, these guys are all like jacked up because they want to be heard. I'm guessing they want to
They
be heard.
want to be heard.
Yeah.
I took a step back and I was like, wow. And then I started doing some reading. I started doing some research. And then I was in this relationship, a new relationship, and that relationship went bad quickly. And it went so bad that it really had an impact on my relationship with Nzinga and her mom. And so even that was going bad. And it was just a bad time. And while I was sitting on my couch, it was so bad that I contemplated killing myself. I was going to commit suicide because I had lost my business. I told you I was doing newspapers. I lost my business. I was in this relationship. It was a bad relationship. The walls just seemed to be closing in. And it was around the same time that we were going through family court, trying to figure that out. And things were just falling apart. And I was sitting there and, you know, I prayed because I always go back to what my mother taught me to do whenever I was in those kind of dark spaces. Take some time, meditate, pray about where you are, get some guidance in that. And while I was sitting there, I simply heard these words in the spirit: speak to the hearts of men. That's what I heard. Speak to the hearts of men. And I didn't know what that meant because I was doing DJing, I was doing all of this other kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I was like, what is that? Speak to the hearts of men. Fast forward, I sat down on my computer that night, and within 7 hours, I had written a 15-page perspective for Fathers Incorporated of all the things that I thought needed to be done with an organization that would help fathers navigate what I was experiencing at that time.
Yeah.
Within 3 days, I had an EIN number, a bank account, a board, a website, business cards, and an office within 3 days for Fathers Incorporated. Yeah. And I just began moving. I just began, you know, internet was still young at that time. There wasn't a lot of, no Facebook, no Twitter, no all that stuff, Black Planet and I forgot the others, MySpace. That was the big things that were out there then. And began to start, you know, going out and speaking in different places, finding people's names, calling them up. I remember calling Joe Jones, who was running the Center for Urban Families out of Baltimore. He had just finished I just saw him in the newspaper talking to President Bush at the time. And I was like, oh, this guy must be a big guy in the space. I remember reaching out to Ron Minty because somebody told me there's a guy in Columbia University that's really big. And I heard about another guy in Washington, Charles Ballard, that they tell me that was in the fatherhood field since the 70s. And I started moving through this network. And at the same time, still wanting to do my work in Albany. And then as I close this story, realized very quickly that doing this simplistic work of helping fathers get custody, visiting time, and navigate their child support issues, I could not help enough men fast enough doing that singular work. And I wanted to do something more systemic. I did not want to do anything in the way of fathers' rights because I didn't believe that that was the way to go, that there was a different way to go to do systemic work. Yeah. And so decided that I wanted to do professional development and capacity building building of organizations who wanted to work and serve specifically men and fathers. And I set out, met some people at the Urban Institute and the Annie E. Casey Foundation and talked to them about this work that I wanted to do, met some other folks, and got a few contracts to go around the country and do trainings and all of this stuff. And Fathers Incorporated just really began to develop. And then I got a job with the state of New York running the New York State Fatherhood Initiative for Governor Pataki. And I began to serve programs across the state of New York who were serving dads. And I learned a lot because my work was within the Division of Child Support. That's where I cut my teeth in doing this within child support and workforce development. And I had programs in the most urban area of New York City to the most rural area of New York State. I had it all. Indian reservations, poor white communities, Latino communities, Black. I was everywhere. And I just, in that 5-year span, had this concentrated incubator of really understanding what this work was. And at the same time, finding out what my path was going to be beyond this work, because I knew that I wasn't going to stay with the state. I wanted to do something bigger than even what the state was doing.
Yeah, but it's a great place for you to learn a lot. And, in the Division on Child Support, it's a classic, follow the money. I mean, that's where there's a lot of passion. There's a lot at stake there. And when you think about where this conversation was then, whatever, 15-ish years ago, and where it is today, where have we made, progress, and where do we still have a long way to go on this fatherhood?
I think one of the biggest issues when I started doing the program for the state of New York was the notion that the responsible fatherhood field was forcing men to be in relationships with moms when they were in a dangerous situation. So there was a huge backlash of the responsible fatherhood field from women's groups and domestic violence groups, because they
wanted them out of that relationship. They wanted a different way for them to be fathers and not be partners.
Their premise was, you're forcing women to take men that are dangerous for them. And it was such a narrow view of what we were trying to do. It took a long time to help them broaden their perspective to see that while that is an issue, it's not an issue for this work. It's an issue we have to pay attention to.
Right.
It's not an issue that should stop us from doing the work that we were trying to do. So we had to expand that. And so I actually had a great relationship with the commissioner then of the Office of Women Affairs for the state of New York, to which the Domestic Violence Agency fell under her purview. And because I worked for our commissioner and the governor, I was able to kind of meet with that level of people. And I used to go to her office and we would sit down and she would be like, Kenny, just tell me about this work you're doing with fathers. Help me understand what it is you're doing. And then we would have these conversations and I would tell her what I was doing. I would tell her some of the stories of the guys that I was working with. And after a while, we actually began to create brochures together and we began to do other things. And what she understood was, my work is not just in your office. I have to have this conversation in every other state agency there is, because of how agencies see dads. And so while your issue is domestic violence, my issue in employment is dads don't want to work. My issue in housing is if they got a job, they can pay rent. If my issue was in health, well, they don't really care about health anyway. Why are we spending money? It's more important that we pay attention to the health of mom, not dads. Everywhere I went, they had their own bias focus on what fathers are and what they should be. And I have to spend a lot of time. So my incubator began to broaden a little bit, so that now I became versed in all of these other different areas to kind of
But it's a lot of education on your part. You've got to educate all these different agencies, because you have this issue that's up here, and there's that phrase: if you're a hammer, everything's a nail. And so, like, if your lens is whatever it is, whatever housing, okay, that's the only thing you see things through. But you're like, okay, that is
Yeah,
perhaps one component of what I'm trying to do, but here's the bigger,
right.
overarching goal. Was there a moment where you felt like you broke through and were really starting to sort of convince people that there were these component parts of what you were working on
Mhm.
fatherhood and what Fathers Incorporated is doing, but that you had to look at fathers, more holistically and not
Mhm.
for, their best days or
Mhm.
their worst days.
Actually, yeah, I used to tell my wife when I was working for the state of New York, and I used to come home, um, and I used to tell her that if I don't see change in the neighborhood that I live in, then I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing in my job. That if I work for the state of New York and I'm working in workforce development and child support and parenting, if I come home every day and I'm hearing the same stories from the families around my house, then obviously my work is not hitting the ground. It was
Right.
always, so I've always been a big person of proof of concept. That if the concept is if you alleviate fathers, you create opportunities and you regulate the societal narrative as it relates to fatherhood, that notion should make itself down into other agencies and then down to families where they feel it as well. And so that did not happen all at once. And then there have been these moments in the last 5 years, right? Where you're now beginning to see other agencies put money in addressing responsible fatherhood in those silos that I talked about, right? And so you had HUD putting money into their authorities to do fatherhood work in their HUD housing around the country. You got HRSA mandating that 1/4 of the individuals that they serve in their early Head Start programs are fathers. You had HHS begin to put money in responsible fatherhood grantees around the country. You had the Department of Labor begin to start talking about creating workforce development opportunities for individuals that were coming out of incarceration and reentry programs. And so, and then you have, now you have, which is, you talk about advancement. Now you have the U.S. Department of Women that have now just put out a grant for male-led organizations to train women-led organizations in understanding the notion of domestic violence from the perspective of men's organizations and
Yeah.
trying to bring those two things together. That grant just came out about 6 months ago. So you're talking about this visceral reaction to responsible fatherhood some 15, 17 years ago, where they wanted to blame the responsible fatherhood space for putting couples together and
Right.
not taking into consideration their safety, to the largest, biggest agency that oversees domestic violence in the country saying, there's something to be said about ensuring that as we protect moms from domestic violence perpetrators, that all fathers aren't perpetrators, and
Right.
that there's a way to do this level of work to get everybody safe, to make sure and ensure that everybody is safe, understanding that at the end of the day, it's the child we're trying to work for. So when you say, have I seen changes?
Yeah.
That's now my proof of concept. I knew back then that the only way to really crack this nut was to go into those individual silos and to get people to understand the importance of responsible fatherhood within their own network, which is why I created this curriculum called What About Dad? And it's been my principle for Fathers Incorporated for the last 15 years. And what I mean about What About Dad? So I'm always conscious about mission drift with my agency, that I'm not going over here, I'm not going over here, I'm not going over here. I'm going to define wherever I
Yeah.
go, but that doesn't limit me to where I go. What that means is I can walk into any room on any subject matter and have relevancy in that room because I only come in with one question, and that is, relative to this conversation, what about dad? Have you taken into consideration dads in this conversation? And if you have not, I'm going to show you where they should be relevant, where you should be having a conversation, and how they should be considered in the conversation that you're having. So whether it's workforce development, whether it's housing, whether it's health, whether it's substance abuse, whether it is, three-legged stools with a broken arm on the back, whether it's automotive film, whether it's work, it does not matter.
Right.
If you're talking to individuals, if you're talking about women and moms, you have to take into consideration men and fathers in that conversation. And so over time, that has been the improvement of what I've seen, and it tends to continue to happen more and more and more. What's left to do is to begin to start being able to express that evolution in this work, so that we can begin to start right-sizing laws and policy so that they don't serve as an obstacle for the work that agencies are trying to do with families on the ground, because that's where the anger is still at. The anger is still at individuals we are a perfect example, right? In Georgia, we have a direct service program. We're working with these guys. We're working with them in their communication. We're working with them in their relationships. They're getting parenting time, they're getting custody, all these great things are happening to them. And then they go into a system in the state of Georgia that says, if you were unmarried at the birth of your child, you are not the legal father of your child. It's the only state in the country that has it. It's called legitimation. Wow. And so while you're doing great work, mom is on board, kids doing well, dad's happy, family is synergizing. Yeah. And then he says, now I want to get visiting time on the books. Oh, hold up, sir. You can't have visiting time in the state because when your child was born, you weren't married. You literally do not have rights to your child. And you have to go through a legal process to get that. And so that's where
that costs time and costs money.
It costs time and it costs money. So when you're talking about low income dads, and it's still, it doesn't matter whether or not you're white, black, green, or whatever. If you don't have the resources to be able to do those types of things, you're still bounded by laws and policies that have not changed. And some of that has not changed because those old systems still hold on to old culture. And so we got to be able to begin to start infiltrating those systems with people who have a different mindset of parental culture, so that those policies and laws begin to change, so that they don't become an obstacle to the great work that's being done on the ground, the great work that you're doing in terms of having this conversation and getting perspective for people. But you don't want people to feel great, like, man, I just listened to this podcast, I'm empowered, I feel like I want to go out there and I want to run the world. And they get out there and boom, they run into something that serves as an obstacle. And it's all as a result of somebody's thought process about who that person is and what they expect of that person, and he can't get around or through that.
What do you think? We talked a lot here. This has been a great conversation. We talked a lot about, sort of on the policy level, state level, federal level. What can companies do? What can employers do in 2022? We just come out of COVID, or coming out of COVID. Well, what can employers do to help men be the best fathers they could be?
Two things. One is invest in organizations that's doing the work, right? So that they are contributing to organizations that are actually trying to ensure that fathers particularly are supported in the same way that they support their other employees. The second thing is to be able to be, what's the best word? Be stewards of your own employees, right? You hear corporations say this all the time, families first. Okay, well, talk to me a little bit about how you're investing in families.
Yeah, what does that actually mean? What do it's words, it sounds great. Like, who doesn't want to say families first? What company would say, families third, that's our policy, families third. You're like, what? I'm not going to work for you.
Absolutely.
Sociopath are you?
But yeah.
It's like, words matter, but how do you then go and translate that into action and to things that employees feel like, oh, okay, my employer really does care about me?
Right. Yeah. I created, during the pandemic, you talk about the pandemic, I created a 3-module curriculum called Dads in the C-Suite. And I created it because of all the conversations I had with men talking about how they were struggling with being a dad in their homes, because the environment changed. These are dads that are now in the house and they're in the way, right? They feel like they're in the way and they're trying to figure out how to position themselves. And even in their homes, many of them are feeling like, I'm home all day long and I still feel like I'm not connected to my family. What can I do to get me more connected to my children? Because I don't do their homework with them and I don't do this
Yeah.
because I'm busy, and my hours of operation is now skewed, because it used to be I left out at 8 in the morning, I came back at 5 in the afternoon, and I could separate my work from my home. But
Right.
now that I'm home, it feels like my phone is ringing at 10 o'clock at night, and it's 5 o'clock in the morning, and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and 4 o'clock here. And I'm on a Zoom call here, and they're having another Zoom call at 7 o'clock. And I seem like I can't stabilize, and that's causing friction in my relationship. How
Yeah.
do I navigate
What
that?
were some of the tips? What were some of the tips that you gave in that curriculum?
So one of them is mandate your family time. Your family time should not be an option. But the beauty in mandating your family time is your family time now doesn't have to be after 6 p.m. on weekdays
Right.
all weekend, right?
Yeah. It
You
could be
can
2 o'clock
say,
in the middle, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and you still get your work done at different times. Yeah. Yep.
absolutely. You know what?
Yep.
We go, hey, let's jump in the car. We getting ready to go to lunch and have food, or we're gonna go to the
Yep.
park and we're gonna walk together, or we're gonna, or if you're doing things individually with your kids, you're gonna walk in. If it's the summertime, you're gonna
Yeah.
walk to your kid's room and sit down and say, oh, I'm gonna play your game in Madden, and you're gonna do something, or you're gonna play board games, or you're gonna watch
Yeah.
movies together. So my thing was, take advantage of the time that you feel like is being forced upon you, but is actually a benefit to you. Stop thinking about it as time that you can't manage, as opposed to time that has been gifted to you for you to do the things that you'd like to do with your family.
And I love this. This is one of my things that I'm so passionate about. It's like, why can't we say, well, why can't you work for an employer that trusts you to get your work done, and you're going to get it done? The project has to be done, whatever, but if you have a child and you want to go see that child's sporting event, or you just want to sit and talk to that child, you want to go and just be with her, go get an ice cream, go take a walk, go whatever,
Right.
make up the beds together. What, just have that conversation. It just makes you a better human being. And I think if you're a better human being, you're going to be a better worker.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't even think about it. We have 13 employees on the ground here in Atlanta, about 35 others scattered around the country, and it's attached to our federal contract. And my staff here in Atlanta, we meet twice a week. We meet on Monday from 10 to 12 and on Thursday from 10 to 12. At the beginning of the week, we talk about what we're going to be doing the rest of the week. And at the end of the week, we talk about what we accomplished during the week. And I don't think about them anymore. As my indicator is on our movies on Thursday, did you get done what you told me you was going to do on Monday? Right.
Yeah.
And if it didn't get done, tell me why it didn't get done. And then on Monday, you could tell me what you're going to get done on next Monday. And so the continuity of always knowing what they all are doing,
Yeah.
and that they're doing it when you need things to be done. I don't have to worry about, somebody saying, for instance, one of my staff came to me today and said, hey, I'm working with this agency. They actually going on a retreat to Savannah next week, all expenses paid, everything. And they're doing some stuff on parenting and engagement.
Yeah.
Can I go? He says, and don't worry about it, because I got my computer and stuff. So I'm going to be online and connected anyway. I'm just not going to be in my house. I'm going to be in Savannah. And I was like, yeah, like my brain was like, whatever. I'm like, I know if I need you, I can get you. And I also know what you're doing. And I know that you being away doesn't stop you from being able to do that. I don't think, Paul, that we're ever going to go back to the way it was in terms of
I hope not.
Right.
I hope not.
Look at you. You in your beautiful home. You got it set up. It looks great in the background. And you're doing what you love to do, right? And you're not stressed by having to leave here and run home because, oh my goodness, my kid has an appointment at 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
You know the irony of this? I can only tell you this on the Company of Dads podcast. The irony of this is my oldest daughter needs to go somewhere, and she's texting me during this call. I said, the podcast wraps up. The podcast is only 30 minutes long. Don't worry, we're going to wrap it up. But that's who my boss is now. It's my 13-year-old daughter saying, what are you doing? I was like, you know what I'm doing. But you know what I think is great about this, Kenneth, is that your employee felt like that he could be transparent with you. He could be honest and say, I'm going to Savannah, got the computers. But you're also setting the example. Like you're having these meetings on Monday, you're having these meetings now if like 3 weeks in a row, somebody says they're going to do something on Monday, they don't get it done on Thursday. That's a performance issue. That's a performance issue. But whatever, that happens no matter what, you know. And now that you're giving these your employees, 50 some odd employees, you're giving them agency. You're giving them the ability to say, okay, I'm going to get this done. And you know what? Some of this stuff, I got to send 20 emails. I can send that at 9 o'clock at night. You know, I don't need to send them at 9 in the morning. You know, I can get all this and still be super productive and advance, you know, the mission, advance what we're trying to do.
Absolutely. And at the same time that was happening, one of my other employees types in the chat, Tino was having chest pains. This is what he tests. Is in the chat. And so we're like, we're all in like, Bo, are you good? And he says, I'm just going to check on him. So his son has he wants to play football, but he's having some heart issues. And so he goes off camera. He don't go off, he just goes off camera.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking that whatever he's dealing with his son. And so then he pops back on camera and he has a mask on. And I'm looking at the background and I'm like, because we see each other twice a week. We know what everybody's houses look like. We know what's in the background. I'm like, and I said, hey, Bo, I said, look like you changed your background. I was like, I said, you good? Where you at? He says, I'm at the hospital. And I said, you're at the hospital? He said, yeah, I just brought him in. I figured it's safe and sorry to bring him in so that they can check him out. He said, he's good. He's laying down. I'm waiting for the doctors to come in. I said, you didn't have to get.
Yeah, right. Get off the call.
I said, you didn't have to get back on the call. He said, no, I'm good. He says, this happens all the time. He says, I got my laptop in front of me. He says, I'm not, he says, basically when I get there, I'm not doing anything. So I might as well sit here and, he's on his phone doing whatever he's doing with his friends on his phone. And I'm sitting here on the computer. And I was like, all right, well, I'm like, well, just text us later on, let us know how he's doing, make sure he's okay. But to your point, like if we were locked into an office, he's got to gather up his stuff. He's got to get in the car. He's got to drive or possibly call an ambulance to take. Now it's more traumatic, right? And because you got an ambulance involved and you're not away and you're in Atlanta, it might take you an hour to get to the house and you're stressed, as opposed to you being at home. To your point about your daughter, you said your daughter just texted you and said, hey, Dad, where you at? His son walked into the room and said, Dad, my chest is bothering me. He goes off camera and he deals with what he has to deal with. Doesn't interrupt anything that we're doing with respect to a phone call. So your question about corporations and what they can do is to really begin to understand that you can incorporate the personal lives of your employees and not have that have a negative impact on your bottom line. In fact, it may even have a positive impact.
It's gonna have a positive. We're gonna end it there. Kenneth Braswell, CEO of Fathers Incorporated, leader in the fatherhood space. Thank you very much for joining me on the Company
Thank you
Dad
so much. It's been a pleasure.